Hey, what's going on YouTube? So we have to look at the question, where's the inflation? This is the question that many Austrian school guys are asked, and let's look at it right now. So in the 1970s, first of all, we had this nasty inflation, right? And what happened was we got off the Bretton Woods gold standard, and what ended up happening was Arthur Burns at the Federal Reserve increased the monetary base from $62 billion to $116 billion. And that led to the inflation. Fast forward right now. We have many Keynesian economists saying that you can't have nasty inflation since the United States can borrow within its own currency. And thus, we're going to have low inflation, and we're also not going to experience the hyperinflation Peter Schiff is talking about. This is what the MMT guys talk about, like Mike Norman. So, this is what even Krugman says. Now, let's go back to what I said about the 1970s. The 1970s, the United States experienced inflation. And they experienced inflation because of all this money printing, which I mentioned via Arthur Burns. He increased the monetary base once again from $62 billion to $116 billion. That's almost an increase of around 84% in the monetary base, and we face nasty inflation. These guys, the MMT guys, state that the only reason why we faced inflation was because of the Arabs. Sure, there were problems with the Mideast, especially in the early 1970s, especially when Israel was involved. But that was only in 1973. There was also 1979 with the Iranians, but you had the nasty inflation because, first of all, the Iranians foolishly pegged their currency. I believe it was the rial at that time as well. They pegged it to the US dollar, and the United States was debasing their currency. So that was part of the reason why the Iranians were protesting in big droves. And this is actually one of the reasons why many of the Mideast countries had these Arab Spring protests in 2011. It was the nasty inflation, but that was because they were foolishly pegging their currency to the United States dollar, just as every other country does. But that's the main focus of it. It's because the US dollar is weak, and because the dollar is weaker than it is, then other countries are going to suffer as well. But going back to the 1970s, the main reason why we had inflation, nasty inflation, was because of money printing. Another reason why we had inflation was because if you look at what happened was we also had Regulation Q, which capped interest rates. Since you capped interest rates, that is eventually going to create some dislocations. And one of the problems with Regulation Q in that environment was inflation. I'm going to talk about Regulation Q later on, but it also led to the S&L crisis in the 1980s. That's a topic for a different day. But going back to today, where is the inflation? So we haven't actually seen the inflation except in the stock market. That's where all the inflation is. All the money actually is on the sidelines. It's sure we do have high inflation if you look at John Williams' number. He's saying it's around 10%. The United States government is around 2%. I'll compromise. I'll say it's around 6 to 7%. And it is true, we do have higher inflation. We're getting smaller size in packaging when it comes to buying food prices or buying food. I mean, when you buy granola bars or any other food items, the packaging is much smaller than what it was back in 2003, 2004. And you're paying pretty much the same price or even more. So that, in my opinion, is inflation. Others may not agree with me, but the Austrian school probably would agree with what I'm trying to say. So, now, the question remains, where's the inflation? Well, we have to also look at this equation that you learn in basic economics if you've taken an economics course, especially in college or even high school. It's MV equals P times Q. So money times velocity equals price times quantity. So the thing is that you are increasing the amount of money out there. So you have an increase in M. And then on the other side of the equation, you have price times quantity. So if the quantity is pretty much staying the same because you're not having an increase in supply of any goods right now, so that means the price would have to increase. And the price would increase, especially, or the price is increasing if you look at the stock market. But you also have some deflationary forces which took place in 2007, 2008 in the housing market. So you have deflationary forces combined with inflationary forces. And on the other side of the equation, m times v, the velocity, which stands for v, or v, which stands for velocity, there's no velocity right now. So long story short, you could pretty much take the nominal GDP divided by the total money supply, and you have low velocity number, or you have a low velocity in the economy. And what does velocity mean? It basically means how fast is the money turning over, and how fast it's actually changing dollars from one hand to the other in a given period of time, especially in a 1-year period. That's one way to describe the velocity, and it's low right now. And if you want to look at the basic economics of it, let's look at it right now. So what's going on is that the demand for money, as weird as it sounds, it's actually increasing because you have all this cash on the sidelines right now. So the higher the money demand means that you have more cash that is hoarded, and that's going on. No one's lending right now. People are not putting their cash in mattresses, but they're putting it in a bank. They're not going to buy as much. They're not going to invest as much. Some people are, but most people aren't. So you're not going to have a lot of money going out of the bank's coffers. So that being said, since the demand of money is a lot higher than where it was before, what does that mean when it comes to the velocity? That means the velocity is not going to change as much as before. So you're going to have lower velocity than in the past. And that's one of the reasons why we're having a low velocity and therefore low inflation as of right now. And another thing to note is that when you have all this money creation by the Federal Reserve, you're actually going to have lower interest rates, which we have right now, and on top of it, you're going to have a high demand for money, which I've mentioned. And currently, the velocity is under 1 if you look at some features, or it could be 1.5 if you take the nominal GDP divided by the total money supply, M2. It's like 16 trillion or 16.4 trillion divided by around 10.3 trillion, total M2. I don't know what it exactly is, but it's around there. So velocity is low. Let's go back to the 1970s. What was the velocity then? At its peak, the velocity was 7.4 in 1980. What that means is that each dollar changed hands 7.4 times in a given year. So that's a lot more than what we're experiencing now. So why don't we have the inflation? It's because of velocity. And you have to notice some trends. The velocity of money actually picks up when interest rates are going up. And the reasoning behind it is that there's no demand for the money, or there's less demand for the money. And that's what happened in the 1980s, or early 1980s, late 1970s. There was essentially a run on the US dollar, and Paul Volcker saved us from that hyperinflation. I wasn't born then, but Paul Volcker saved the United States for 3 decades. And right now, we have low interest rates. So the demand for money, as weird as it sounds, is actually much higher than where it would be. And because of that, all this cash is hoarded, and the velocity of money is low. And what will only make velocity of money go up is if you have a black swan event. Maybe if you have all these countries try to repatriate their gold, you may have a run on the dollar. That's one thing. Or 2, you may have the economy slowly but steadily improve. Obama is an anti-business president. Since he's anti-business, all this money is still going to be on the sidelines. So putting all these things together, in order for that nasty inflation or the hyperinflation the Austrian school guys are talking about, guys that I follow, guys that most of you follow, well, you need the velocity of money to pick up. And with the low velocity around 1, looking at all these numbers, you're not going to see that inflation. You have to remember that, first of all, right now we experienced a quadruple bypass in 2007, 2008. Our financial system was about to collapse, just like the 1930s. And in the 1930s, we had low velocity of money and low interest rates. as well. So we have pretty much the same thing as the 1930s, but the only difference right now is we've printed up all this monopoly money, which has created some inflation, and on top of it, it has led to some deflation. Not the money printing, but what happened when it came to the financial crisis. We were supposed to face deflation, but we haven't. So right now we're facing mild inflation. Some people may call it inflation like the 1970s, but that's what people who are looking at John Williams statistics are saying. So, long story short, we're going to have that nasty inflation if and only if the velocity of money picks up. Remember, inflation is always a monetary phenomenon. We already got some inflation in the stock market. Now the question is, will the velocity pick up? And I believe it will, but the question is when? Probably within the next few years. If you have a supply-side president who comes in, cuts taxes, tries to get the economy going, just watch out for the inflation. It's going to be nasty. Or if you have all these countries starting to repatriate their gold because the central banks don't actually have that gold because they've lent it out. That's what I think is going to happen. Either a black swan or you're going to have a pro-business president come in 2016. We shall see what happens. Anyways, thanks for listening to me, guys. Hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't, and leave your thoughts below. Thanks, guys.